Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, by Just Stories. Chapter 1: The Rise of Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the island of Corsica in 1769. Although Corsica was part of France, the Bonaparte family had Italian roots, and Napoleon grew up speaking Italian at home. Despite his small stature, Napoleon was a brilliant military strategist and charismatic leader, and he would go on to become one of the most famous and controversial figures in European history. Napoleon's rise to power began in 1796, when he was appointed to lead the French army in Italy. At the time, France was embroiled in a series of wars with other European powers, and the army was badly in need of a successful commander. Napoleon proved to be just the man for the job, winning a series of decisive victories over the Austrian army and earning the nickname the Little Corporal from his troops. By 1799, Napoleon had become a hero in France, and when political instability led to a coup d'état that overthrew the existing government, he was well positioned to seize power. In November of that year, he established the consulate, a new form of government that gave him almost complete control over France. Napoleon was a master of propaganda, and he used his position to cultivate an image of himself as a savior of the French people. He abolished feudalism and introduced a series of reforms aimed at modernizing the country. He also reorganized the French legal system and established the Napoleonic Code, a set of laws that are still influential in many parts of the world today. Despite his popularity, however, Napoleon faced constant challenges to his authority. In 1804, he took the bold step of declaring himself Emperor of France, a move that outraged many of his opponents but also helped to solidify his position. He began to expand the French Empire, conquering much of Europe and establishing satellite states throughout the continent. Napoleon's military campaigns were often marked by brilliant tactical maneuvers, but they also came at a terrible cost in human lives. The Napoleonic Wars were some of the bloodiest conflicts in history, and the French army was often accused of brutalizing the populations of the countries it occupied. Despite these criticisms, Napoleon remained a hugely popular figure in France throughout much of his reign. He was seen as a symbol of French greatness and a defender of the rights of the common people. However, his empire was built on shaky foundations, and by the early 19th century, cracks were beginning to appear. In the next chapter, we'll explore the early stages of the Napoleonic Wars and the challenges that Napoleon faced as he sought to maintain his grip on power. Chapter 2: The Wars Begin. By the early 19th century, Europe was a powder keg waiting to explode. The various great powers were jostling for position, and tensions were high. Napoleon's aggressive expansion of the French Empire only added to the sense of unease, and it was only a matter of time before war broke out once again. The first major conflict of the Napoleonic Wars was the War of the Third Coalition, which began in 1805. This war saw a coalition of European powers, including Britain, Russia, Austria, and Sweden, unite against France. The main theater of the war was Central Europe, where French forces clashed with Austrian and Russian armies. The war got off to a bad start for the coalition, as Napoleon scored a decisive victory over the Austrian army at the Battle of Ulm. This was followed by a stunning triumph at the Battle of Austerlitz, where Napoleon's forces crushed a combined Austrian and Russian army. This victory cemented Napoleon's position as the dominant military power in Europe, and it forced Austria and Russia to sue for peace. However, the peace was short-lived. Napoleon's territorial ambitions continued to grow, and he began to encroach on the interests of other European powers. In 1807, he launched an invasion of Russia, which ended in disaster. Although he was initially successful, the harsh Russian winter and fierce resistance from the Russian army eventually forced Napoleon to retreat. Of the 400,000 soldiers who entered Russia, only 10,000 returned to France alive. The failure of the Russian campaign marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. His enemies smelled blood, and they began to plot against him. In 1812, Prussia joined the anti-French coalition, and in 1813, Austria and Russia also declared war. The resulting conflict, known as the War of the Sixth Coalition, was fought across Europe and involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The war was marked by a series of battles and skirmishes, including the famous Battle of Leipzig, which saw a coalition army of over 500,000 troops defeat a French force half its size. In the end, the sheer weight of numbers proved too much for Napoleon's army, and he was forced to abdicate in 1814. However, Napoleon was not one to go down without a fight. In 1815, he made a dramatic return to France and attempted to regain power. This led to the final major conflict of the Napoleonic Wars, the 100 Days. Although Napoleon scored some early victories, his forces were ultimately defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, and he was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would spend the remainder of his life. The Napoleonic Wars were some of the most significant conflicts in European history. They marked the end of the old order and paved the way for the emergence of new nation-states and political ideologies. In the next chapter, we'll explore one of the most brutal and tragic theaters of the Napoleonic Wars, the Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal. Chapter 3: The Peninsular War. While the Napoleonic Wars were fought across much of Europe, one of the most brutal and tragic theaters of the conflict was the Peninsular War, which was fought in Spain and Portugal. This war saw French forces pitted against local guerrilla fighters and regular armies alike, and it resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. The Peninsular War began in 1807, when Napoleon's army invaded Portugal. This move was prompted by Portugal's refusal to comply with the continental system, a trade embargo that Napoleon had imposed on Britain. However, the French soon found themselves facing unexpected resistance from the local population, who were fiercely patriotic and deeply resentful of the French occupation. In response, Spanish guerrilla fighters began to organize themselves into small, mobile units that could strike at French supply lines and disrupt their operations. These fighters, known as guerrilleros, were often poorly armed and poorly trained, but they were highly motivated and knew the terrain well. They would prove to be a thorn in the side of the French army for years to come. The French responded to the guerrilla threat with brutal force. They burned villages, executed suspected rebels, and imposed heavy taxes on the local population. These tactics only served to fuel the flames of resistance, and the Spanish people rallied behind the guerrilla fighters. Despite their initial setbacks, the French were able to gain the upper hand in the early stages of the war. They defeated the Spanish army at the Battle of Tudela in 1808 and occupied Madrid later that year. However, their position soon began to deteriorate as the guerrilla fighters continued to harass them and disrupt their supply lines. The turning point of the war came in 1812, when British forces under the command of Arthur Wellesley landed in Portugal and began to push the French back. The British were joined by Spanish and Portuguese armies, and together they launched a series of offensives that would eventually drive the French out of the Iberian Peninsula. The final major battle of the Peninsular War was the Battle of Toulouse, fought on April 10, 1814. This battle saw the French army defeated by a coalition of British, Spanish, and Portuguese forces, and it effectively ended the war. Although there were some minor skirmishes in the following years, the Peninsular War was over. The Peninsular War was a brutal and tragic conflict that took a heavy toll on the people of Spain and Portugal. It also had wider implications for the Napoleonic Wars as a whole, as it tied up French forces and drained resources that could have been used elsewhere. Despite the horrors of the war, however, it also served to strengthen the resolve of the Spanish and Portuguese people and to forge a sense of national identity that would endure long after the conflict was over. Chapter 4: The Russian Campaign. In 1812, Napoleon launched one of the most audacious military campaigns in history, an invasion of Russia. His goal was to force Tsar Alexander I to comply with his demands, but the campaign would prove to be a disaster, one that would ultimately lead to Napoleon's downfall. Napoleon's army was one of the largest and best trained in history. It included soldiers from across Europe, as well as elite cavalry and artillery units. In total, the French army numbered around 600,000 men. The Russian campaign began in June 1812, with the French army crossing the border into Russia. The campaign got off to a good start for the French, as they were able to win a series of early victories and capture several key cities. However, the Russians refused to engage in a pitched battle, preferring instead to adopt a strategy of scorched earth, retreating deep into Russia and destroying everything in their path. As the French army advanced deeper into Russia, they began to encounter more and more resistance. The harsh Russian winter made conditions extremely difficult, and the army's supply lines began to break down. Russian guerrilla fighters harassed the French at every opportunity, and disease and starvation began to take a heavy toll on the soldiers. Despite these challenges, Napoleon refused to retreat. He was convinced that the Russian army would eventually be forced to engage in a decisive battle, and he wanted to be there when it happened. However, the battle he was hoping for never materialized. Instead, the Russian army simply retreated deeper into the countryside, leaving the French army stranded and vulnerable. As winter set in, the situation for the French army became increasingly desperate. Temperatures plunged to well below freezing, and many soldiers began to suffer from frostbite and hypothermia. Food and supplies were in short supply, and disease ran rampant through the ranks. The army's horses, which were essential for transportation and supplies, began to die in droves. In December 1812, Napoleon was forced to order a retreat. The French army began to make its way back towards Europe, but the conditions were harsh and the Russian army continued to harass them at every opportunity. By the time the French reached the border, only a fraction of the original army remained. Of the 600,000 soldiers who had set out on the campaign, only around 40,000 returned alive. The failure of the Russian campaign marked a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon's aura of invincibility was shattered, and his enemies smelled blood. It also marked the beginning of the end for the French Empire. Napoleon was forced to abdicate in 1814, and although he made a brief comeback in 1815, he was ultimately defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to the island of St. Helena. The Russian campaign was a disaster of epic proportions, but it also had wider implications for European history. It marked the beginning of the end for the French Empire, and it paved the way for the emergence of new nation-states and political ideologies. The lessons of the campaign would be studied and analyzed by military strategists for generations to come. Chapter 5: The Battle of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, was the final major conflict of the Napoleonic Wars. It saw a coalition of British, Prussian, and other European troops face off against Napoleon's forces in what would be one of the most famous battles in history. The battle began early in the morning, as French troops launched an assault on the British positions. The fighting was fierce, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. However, the British were able to hold their ground, thanks in large part to the skillful leadership of their commander, the Duke of Wellington. As the day wore on, the battle began to turn in favor of the coalition forces. A Prussian army under the command of General Blücher arrived on the field, tipping the balance of the battle in favor of the Allies. Meanwhile, the French army began to suffer from supply and communication problems, and their troops began to lose cohesion. The decisive moment of the battle came in the late afternoon, when the British cavalry, led by the legendary charge of the Scots Greys, launched a devastating attack on the French infantry. The attack shattered the French lines, and the British and Prussian forces were able to press their advantage. By nightfall, the battle was over. The French army had suffered a crushing defeat, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate for the second and final time. He was exiled to the island of St. Helena, where he would spend the remainder of his life. The Battle of Waterloo was one of the most significant conflicts in European history. It marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the beginning of a new era of European politics. It also had wider implications for the world as a whole, as it helped to cement Britain's position as a dominant global power. Today, the battlefield at Waterloo is a popular tourist attraction, and visitors can see the site of the battle and learn about the tactics and strategies used by both sides. The battle is also commemorated in literature and art, and it remains one of the most famous and iconic conflicts in history. In the end, the Battle of Waterloo was a fitting conclusion to the epic story of the Napoleonic Wars. It was a battle that saw the forces of freedom and democracy triumph over tyranny and aggression, and it helped to shape the course of European history for generations to come. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss out on our next video.